Chapter 5. I just don't buy it, Eve muttered as she called up data on Fitzhugh. She studied his bold, striking face as it flashed onto her monitor, shook her head. I just don't buy it, she repeated. She scanned his date and place of birth, saw that he'd been born in Philadelphia during the last decade of the previous century. He'd been married to a male Licent Barrows from 2033 to 2036, divorced, no children. He'd moved to New York the same year as his divorce, established his criminal law practice, and as far as she could see, had never looked back. Annual income, she requested. Subject Fitzhugh, annual income for last tax year, $2,700,000 Bloodsucker, she murmured. Computer, list and detail any arrests. Searching. No police record on file. Okay, so he's clean. How about this? List all civil suits filed against subject. She got a hit on that, a short list of names, and she ordered a hard copy. She requested a list of cases Fitzhugh had lost over the last 10 years. Noted the names that mirrored the suits filed against him. It made her sigh. It was typical litigation of the era. Your lawyer doesn't get you off, you sue the lawyer. It gave another jab to her hopeful theory of blackmail. Okay, so maybe we're going about this the wrong way. New subject, Fox, Arthur, residence 5002 Madison Avenue, New York. Searching. The computer blipped and whined, causing Eve to slap the unit with the heel of her hand to jog it back. She didn't bother to curse budget cuts. Fox appeared on screen, wavering a bit until Eve gave the computer another smack. More attractive, she noted, when he smiled. He was 15 years younger than Fitzhugh, had been born in East Washington, the son of 2 career military personnel, had lived in various points of the globe until he had settled in New York in 2042 and joined the Nutrition for Life organization as a consultant. His annual income just tipped into the 6 figures. The record showed no marriages but the same-sex license he shared with Fitzhugh. List and detail any arrests. The machine grumbled as if it were tired of answering questions, but the list popped. 1 disorderly conduct, 2 assaults, and 1 disturbing the peace. Well, now we're getting somewhere. Both subjects, list and detail any psychiatric consults. There was nothing on Fitzhugh, but she got another hit on Fox. With a grunt, she ordered a hard copy, then glanced up as Peabody entered. Forensics, toxicology. Forensics isn't in, but we've got docs. Peabody handed Eve a disc. Low-level alcohol, identified as Parisian brandy. 2045. Not nearly enough to debilitate. No other drug traces. Shit. She'd been hopeful. I might have something here. Our friend Fox spent a lot of his childhood on the therapist's couch. He checked himself into the Delroy Institute just 2 years ago for a month. And he's done time. Piss away time. But time nonetheless. 90 days lockup for assault. And he had to wear a Proby bracelet for 6 months. Our boy has some violent tendencies. Peabody frowned at the data. Military family. They tend to be resistant to homosexuality still. I bet they tried to head shrink him into hetero. Maybe. But he's got a history of mental health problems and a criminal record. Let's see what the uniforms turned up when they knocked on doors in Fitzhugh's building. And we'll talk to Fitzhugh's associates in his firm. You're not buying suicide. I knew him. He was arrogant, pompous, smug, vain. Eve shook her head. Vain, arrogant men don't choose to be found naked in the bathtub, swimming in their own blood. He was a brilliant man. Lenore Bastwick sat in her custom-made leather chair in the glass-walled corner office of Fitzhugh, Bastwick, and stern. Her desk was a glass pool, unsmudged and sparkling. It suited, Eve thought, her icy and stunning blonde beauty. He was a generous friend, Lenore added and folded her perfectly manicured hands on the edge of the desk. We're in shock here, Lieutenant. It was hard to see shock on the polished surface of it all. New York's steel forest rose up glittering behind Lenore's back, lending the lofty illusion that she was reigning over their city. Pale rose and soft grey added elegant muted color to an office that was as meticulously decorated as the woman herself. Do you know of any reason why Fitzhugh would have taken his own life? Absolutely none. Lenore kept her hands very still, her eyes level. He loved life, his work. He enjoyed every minute of every day as much as anyone I've ever met. I have no idea why he would choose to end it. When was the last time you saw or spoke with him? She hesitated. Eve could almost see wheels working smoothly behind those heavily lashed eyes. Actually, I saw him briefly last night. I dropped a file off for him, discussed a case. That discussion is, of course, privileged. Her slick lips curved. But I will say he was his usual enthusiastic self, and he was very much looking forward to dueling with you in court. Dueling? That's how Fitz referred to cross-examination of expert and police witnesses. A smile flickered over her face. It was a match, in his mind, of wits and nerve. A professional game for an innate game player. I don't know of anything he enjoyed so much as being in court. What time did you drop off the file last night? I'd say about 10. Yes, I think it was around 10. I'd worked late here and slipped by on my way home. Was that usual, Miss Bastwick? You slipping by to see him on your way home? Not unusual. We were, after all, professional associates, and our cases sometimes overlapped. That's all you were? Professional partners? Do you assume, Lieutenant, that because a man and woman are physically attractive and on friendly terms that they can't work together without sexual tension? I don't assume anything. How long did you stay discussing your case? 20 minutes, a half hour. I didn't time it. He was fine when I left. I'll tell you that. There was nothing he was particularly concerned about. He had some concerns about the Salvatore Matteri and others, as well. Nothing out of the ordinary. He was a confident man. And outside of work. On a personal level, a private man. But you know Arthur Fox? Of course. In this firm we take care to know and socialize at least lightly with the spouses of partners and associates. Arthur and Fitz were devoted to each other. Know a broken bar spats? Lenore cocked a brow. I wouldn't know. Sure you would, Eve thought. You and Mr. Fitzhugh were partners. You had a close professional and apparently a close personal relationship. He must have discussed his home life with you from time to time. He and Arthur were very happy. Lenore's first sign of irritation showed in the gentle tapping of a coral tone's nail against the edge of glass. Happy couples occasionally have arguments. I imagine you argue with your husband from time to time. My husband hasn't recently found me dead in the bathtub, Eve said evenly. What did Fox and Fitzhugh argue about? Lenore let out an annoyed huff of breath. She rose, punched in a code on her auto chef, took out a steaming cup of coffee. None was offered to Eve. Arthur had periodic bouts of depression. He is not the most self-confident of men. He tended to be jealous, which exasperated Fitz. Her brows knit. You're probably aware that Fitz was married before. His bisexuality was somewhat of a problem for Arthur, and when he was depressed, he tended to worry about all the men and women Fitz came into contact with in the course of his work. They rarely argued, but when they did, it was generally about Arthur's jealousy. Did he have reason to be jealous? As far as I know, Fitz was completely faithful. It's not always an easy choice, Lieutenant, being in the spotlight as he was, and given his lifestyle. Even today, there are some who are let's say uncomfortable with less than traditional sexual preferences. But Fitz gave Arthur no reason to be anything less than content. Yet he was. Thank you, Eve said as she rose. You've been very helpful. Lieutenant, Lenore began as even the silent Peabody started for the door. If I thought for one instant that Arthur Fox had anything to do with she stopped, sucked in a breath. No, it's simply impossible to believe. Less possible than believing Fitzhugh slashed his own wrists and let himself bleed to death. Eve waited a beat, then left the office. Peabody waited until they'd stepped out onto the skywalk that ribboned the building. I don't know whether you were planting seeds or digging for worms. Both. Eve looked through the glass of the tube. She could see Rourke's office building, shooting tall and polished ebony among the other spears. At least he had no connection with this case. She didn't have to worry about uncovering something he'd done or someone he'd known too well. She knew both the victim and the suspect, and Fox didn't mention her slipping by to discuss work last night. So you've bumped Fox from witness to suspect. Eve watched a man in a tailored robe squawk bad-temperedly into a Palm link as he glided by. Until we prove conclusively it was suicide, Fox is the prime hell, the only suspect. He had the means. It was his knife. He had the opportunity. They were alone in the apartment. He had the motive. Money. Now we know he has a history of depression, a record of violence, and a jealous streak. Can I ask you something? Peabody waited for Eve's nod. You didn't care for Fitzhugh on a professional or a personal level. I hated his fucking guts. So what? Eve stepped off the skywalk and onto the street level where she'd been lucky enough to find a parking spot. She spied a Glida grill, smoking soy dogs and potato rings, and made a beeline through the heavy pedestrian traffic. You think I've got to like the corpse? Give me a couple of dogs and a scoop of potatoes. 2 tubes of Pepsi. Diet for me. Peabody interrupted and rolled her eyes over Eve's long, lean form. Some of us have to worry about weight. Diet dog. Diet Pep. The woman running the cart had a dingy CZ stud in the center of her top lip and a tattoo of the subway system on her chest. The line veered off and disappeared under the loose gauze covering her breasts. Reg dog. Reg Pep. Hot potatoes. Cash or credit? Eve shoved the limp cardboard holding the food at Peabody and dug for her tokens. What's the damage? The woman poked a grimy purple-tipped finger at her console, sent it beeping. 25. Shit. You blink and dogs go up. Eve poured credits into the woman's outstretched hand, grabbed a couple of wafer-thin napkins. She worked her way back, plopped down on the bench circling the fountain in front of the law building. The panhandler beside her looked hopeful. Eve tapped her badge. He grinned, tapped the beggar's license hung around his neck. Resigned, she dug out a 5-credit chip, passed it over. Find someplace else to hustle, she ordered him, or I'll run that license and see if it's up to date. He said something uncomplimentary about her line of work, but he pocketed the credit and moved on, giving room to Peabody. Lenore doesn't like Arthur Fox. Peabody swallowed gamely. Diet dogs were invariably grainy. She doesn't. A high-class lawyer doesn't give that many answers unless she wants to. She fed us that Fox was jealous, that they argued. Eve held out the scoop of greasy potatoes. After a brief internal struggle, Peabody dug in. She wanted us to have that data. Still isn't much. There's nothing in Fitzhugh's records that implicates Fox. His diary, his appointment book, his A-link logs. None of the data I scan points the finger. Then again, none of it indicates a suicidal bent, either. Contemplatively, Eve sucked on her tube of Pepsi, watched New York lumber by with all its noise and sweat. We'll have to talk to Fox again. I've got caught again this afternoon. I want you to go back to Cop Central, get the door-to-door report, nag the me for the final autopsy. I don't know what the hang-up is there, but I want the results by end of shift. I should be out of court by 3. We'll do another walkthrough of Fitzhugh's apartment and see why he omitted Bastwick's little visit. Peabody juggled food and duly programmed the duties into her day log. What I asked before about you not liking Fitzhugh, I just wondered if it was harder to push all the buttons when you had bad feelings about the subject. Cops don't have personal feelings. Then she sighed. Bullshit. You put those feelings aside and push the buttons. That's the job. And if I happen to think a man like Fitzhugh deserved to end up bailing in his own blood, it doesn't mean I won't do what's necessary to find out how he got there. Peabody nodded. A lot of other cops would just file it. Self-termination. End of transmission. I'm not other cops, and neither are you, Peabody. She glanced over, mildly interested at the explosive crash as 2 taxis collided. Pedestrian and street traffic barely hitched as smoke billowed, duraglass pinged, and 2 furious drivers popped like corks out of their ruined vehicles. Eve nibbled away at her lunch as the 2 men pushed, shoved, and shouted imaginative obscenities. She imagined they were obscenities, anyway. since no English was exchanged. She looked up but didn't spot one of the hovering traffic copters. With a thin smile, she balled up the cardboard, rolled up the empty tube, passed them to Peabody. "Dump these in the recycler, will you? Then come back and give me a hand breaking up those two idiots." "Sir," one of them just pulled out a bat. "Should I call for backup?" "Nope." Eve rubbed her hands together in anticipation as she rose. "I can handle it." Eve's shoulder was still smarting when she walked out of court a couple of hours later. She imagined the cab drivers would have been released by now, which wasn't going to happen to the child killer Eve had just testified against. She thought with satisfaction. She'd be in high security lockup for the next 50 years minimum. There was some satisfaction in that. Eve rolled her bruised shoulder. The cabbie really hadn't been swinging at her, she thought. He'd been trying to crack his opponent's head open, and she'd just gotten in the way. Still, it wasn't going to hurt her feelings that both of them would have their licenses suspended for 3 months. She climbed into her car and, favoring her shoulder, put the vehicle on auto to Cop Central. Overhead, a tourist tram blatted out the standard spiel about the scales of justice. Well, she mused, sometimes they balanced. If only for a short time. Her A-link beeped. Dallas. Dr. Morris. The medical examiner had heavy-lidded hawk eyes in a vivid shade of green, a squared-off chin that was generously stubbled, and a slick-back mane of charcoal hair. Eve liked him. Though she was often frustrated by his lack of stellar speed, she appreciated his thoroughness. "Have you finished the report on Fitzhugh?" "I have a problem." "I don't need a problem, I need the report." "Can you transmit it to my office A-link?" "I'm on my way there." "No, Lieutenant, you're on your way here. I have something I need to show you." "I don't have time to come by the morgue." "Make time," he suggested, and ended the transmission. Eve ground her teeth once. Scientists were so damned frustrating, she thought as she redirected her unit. From the outside, the lower Manhattan City morgue resembled one of the beehive-structured office buildings that surrounded it. It blended, that had been the point of the redesign. Nobody liked to think of death, to have it spoil their appetite as they scooted out of work at lunchtime to grab a bite at a corner deli. Images of bodies tagged and bagged on refrigerated slabs tended to put you off your pasta salad. Eve remembered the first time she'd stepped through the black steel doors in the rear of the building. She'd been a rookie in uniform shoulder to shoulder with 24 other rookies in uniforms. Unlike several of her comrades, she'd seen death up close and personal before, but she'd never seen it displayed, dissected, analyzed. There was a gallery above one of the autopsy labs, and their students, rookies, and journalists or novelists with the proper credentials could witness firsthand the intricate workings of forensic pathology. Individual monitors in each seat offered close-up views to those with the stomach for it. Most of them didn't come back for a return trip. Many who left were carried out. Eve had walked out on her own steam, and she'd been back countless times since, but she never looked forward to the visits. Her target this time wasn't what was referred to as the theater, but Lab C, where Morris conducted most of his work. Eve passed down the white-tiled corridor with its pea-green floors. She could smell death there, no matter what was used to eradicate it. The sulky stink of it slid through cracks, around doorways, and it tainted the air with the grinning reminder of mortality. Medical science had eradicated plagues, a host of diseases and conditions, extending life expectancy to an average of 150 years. Cosmetic technology had ensured that a human being could live attractively for his century and a half. You could die without wrinkles, without age spots, without aches and pains and disintegrating bones. But you were still going to die sooner or later. For many who came here, that day was sooner. She stopped in front of the door at Lab C, held her badge up to the security camera, and gave her name and ID number to the speaker. Her palm print was analyzed and cleared. The door slid open. It was a small room, windowless and depressing, lined with equipment, beeping with computers. Some of the tools ranged neat as a surgeon's tray on the counters were barbaric enough to make the weak shudder. Saws, lasers, the glinting blades of scalpels, hoses. In the center of the room was a table with gutters on the side to catch fluids and run them into sterilized, airtight containers for further analysis. On the table was Fitzhugh, his naked body bearing the scars of the recent insult of a standard Y cut. Morris was sitting on a rolling stool in front of a monitor, face pushed close to the screen. He wore a white lab coat that fluttered to the floor. It was one of his few affectations, the coat that flapped and swirled like a highwayman's cape whenever he walked down the corridors. His slick back hair was snugged into a long ponytail. Eve knew, since he'd called her indirectly rather than passing her off to one of his techs, that it was something unusual. "Dr. Morris, Lieutenant," he began without turning around. "Never seen anything like it. Not in 30 years of exploring the dead." He swung around with a flutter of his lab coat. Beneath it he wore stovepipe pants and a t-shirt in loud, clashing colors. "You're looking well, Lieutenant." He gave her one of his quick, charming smiles, and her lips curved up in response. "You're looking pretty good, yourself." "You lost the beard." He reached up, rubbed a hand over his stubbly chin. He'd sported a precise goatee until recently. "Didn't suit me. But Christ, I hate to shave." "How was the honeymoon?" Automatically, she tucked her hands in her pockets. "It was good. I've got a pretty full plate right now, Morris." "What do you have to show me you couldn't show me on screen?" "Some things take personal attention." He rode his stool over to the autopsy table until he pulled up with a slight squeal of wheels at Fitzhugh's head. "What do you see?" She glanced down. "A dead guy." Morris nodded, as if pleased. "What we would call a normal, everyday dead guy who expired due to excessive blood loss. Possibly self-inflicted." "Possibly?" She leapt on the word. "From the surface, suicide is the logical conclusion. There were no drugs in his system, very little alcohol. He shows no offensive nor defensive wounds or bruising. Their blood settlement was consistent with his position in the tub. He did not drown. The angle of the wrist wounds a broken bar." He bumped closer, picked up one of Fitzhugh's limp, beautifully manicured hands where on the wrist the carved wounds resembled some intricate, ancient language. "They are also very consistent with self-infliction. A right-handed man, reclining slightly." He demonstrated, holding an imaginary blade. "Very quick, very precise slashes to the wrist, severing the artery." Though she'd already studied the wounds herself, and photographs of them, she stepped closer, looked again. Why couldn't someone have come up from behind him, leaned over, slashed down at that same angle? It's not beyond the realm of possibility, but if that were the case, I'd expect to see some defensive wounds. If someone snuck into your bath and sliced your wrist, you'd be inclined to become annoyed, quarrelsome. He beamed a smile. "I don't think you just settle back in the tub and bleed to death. So you're going with self-termination?" "Not so fast." "I was prepared to." He tugged on his bottom lip, let it snap back into place. "I ran the standard brain analysis required with any self-termination or suspected self-termination. That's the puzzle here. The real puzzle." He scooted his stool over to his workstation, gestured over his shoulder for her to follow. "This is his brain," he said, tapping a finger on the organ floating in clear liquid and attached to wire-thin cables that fed into the mainframe of his computer. "Abnormal." "I beg your pardon." Morris chuckled, shook his head. "Obviously you don't make time to watch enough classic videos." "That's from a takeoff on the Frankenstein myth. What I'm saying is, this brain is abnormal." He had brain damage. Damage, well, it seems an extreme word for what I've found. Here, on the screen. He swiveled around, tapped some keys. A close-up view of Fitzhugh's brain flashed on. Again, on the surface, completely as expected. "But we show the cross-section." He tapped again, and the brain was sliced neatly in half. "So much went on in this small mass," Morris murmured. Thoughts, ideas, music, desires, poetry, anger, hate." "People speak of the heart, Lieutenant, but it's the brain that holds all the magic and mystery of the human species. It elevates us, separates us, defines us as individuals. And the secrets of it are, well, it's doubtful we'll ever know them all." "See here." Eve leaned closer, trying to see what he indicated with the tap of a finger on the screen. "It looks like a brain to me, unattractive but necessary. Not to worry, I nearly missed it myself. For this imaging," he went on while the monitor whirled with color and shapes, "the tissue appears in blues, pale to dark, the bone white. Blood vessels are red. As you can see, there are no clots or tumors that would indicate neurological disorders in the making." Enhance Quadrant B, sections 35 to 40, 30%. The screen jumped and a section of the image enlarged. Losing patience, Eve started to shrug, then leaned in. "What is that? It looks like a broken bar." "What? A smudge?" "It does, doesn't it?" He beamed again, staring at the screen where a faint shadow no bigger than a fly speck marred the brain. "Almost like a fingerprint, a child's oily finger." "But when you enhance again," he did so with a few brief commands, popping the image closer. "It's more of a tiny burn." "How would you get a burn inside your brain?" "Exactly." Obviously fascinated, Morris swiveled toward the brain in question. "I've never seen anything like that tiny pinprick mark. It wasn't caused by a hemorrhage, a small stroke, or an aneurysm. I've run all the standard brain imaging programs and can find no known neurological cause for it. But it's there." "Indeed, it is." "It could be nothing, no more than a faint abnormality that caused the occasional vague headache or dizziness. It certainly wouldn't be fatal. But it is curious. I've sent for all of Fitzhugh's medical records to see if there were any tests run or any data on this burn. Could it cause depression, anxiety? I don't know. It floors the left frontal lobe of the right cerebral hemisphere. Current medical opinion is that certain aspects, such as personality, are localized in this specific cerebral area. So it does appear in the section of the brain that we now believe receives and deploys suggestions and ideas." He moved his shoulders. "However, I can't document that this flaw contributed to death. The fact is, Dallas, at the moment, I'm baffled but fascinated. I won't be releasing your case until I find some answers." A burn in the brain, Eve mused as she uncoded the locks on Fitzhugh's condo. She'd come alone, wanting the emptiness, the silence, to give her own brain time to work. Until she had cleared the scene, Fox would have other living quarters. She retraced her steps upstairs, studied the grisly bath again. A burn in the brain, she thought again. Drugs seemed the most logical answer. If they hadn't showed on docs, it could be it was a new type of drug, one that had yet to be registered. She walked into the relaxation room. There was nothing there but the expensive toys of a wealthy man who enjoyed his leisure time. Couldn't sleep, she mused. Came in to relax, had a brandy. Stretched out in the chair, watched some screen. Her lips pursed as she picked up the VR goggles beside the chair. Took a quick trip. Didn't want to use the chamber for it, just kicked back. Curious, she slipped on the goggles, ordered the last scene played. She was popped into a swaying white boat on a cool green river. Birds soared overhead, a fish bulleted up, flashed silver, and dove again. On the banks of the river were wildflowers and tall, shielding trees. She felt herself floating, let her hand dip into the water to trail a quiet wake. It was nearly sunset, and the sky was going pink and purple in the west. She could hear the low hum of bees, the cheerful chirp of crickets. The boat rocked like a cradle. Stifling a yawn, she pulled the goggles off again. A harmless, sedative scene, she decided, and set the goggles down. Nothing that would have induced a sudden urge to slash one's wrists. But the water might have prompted the urge for a hot bath, so he'd taken one. And if Fox had crept in, had been quiet enough, quick enough, he could have done it. It was all she had, Eve decided, and took out her communicator to order a second interview with Arthur Fox.